and start. Hey everyone, we'll be starting shortly. We're just going to give everyone some time to join the meeting. Seems like we have about 20 plus attendants here, so we'll start in a minute or so. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to workshop 1 of the Market Octavia Living Alleys project. I just want to start off tonight by thanking everyone for taking the time out of your evening to participate in tonight's virtual presentation. Everyone's feedback tonight is going to be essential in our goal of providing the Market Octavia area with living alleys that are going to be beneficial to the communities. So we have a lot of information for everyone today, so we're going to do our best to get through this as quickly as possible and allow everyone some time to ask questions at the end. Quick introduction, I'm Arun Bhatia. I'll be the project manager of the project. Myself and Patrick Race will be presenting today, and Patrick will be leading the landscape architecture design efforts of the project. Next slide, please. So the objective of workshop 1 today is to provide an update on the Living Alleys program, including budget and timeline for implementation, as well as obtaining feedback to help prioritize alleys to receive these improvements within our constrained budget. Next slide, please. So our agenda tonight, we'll start off with an introduction to the project, what a living alley is, potential living alleys in this project, as well as funding and implementation timelines. We'll provide you some background on the origins of this project, potential design elements, and previously completed living alleys. We'll move forward into project information such as our criteria and rubric for selection and the various levels of improvements that are possible. And we'll finish off with our next steps of incorporating your feedback into our rubric and informing everyone of our upcoming outreach events. Following completion of this presentation, we'll use the remaining time to answer any questions. Review suggestions and share stories as time permits. Due to our time limit, I highly encourage everyone to ask questions as the presentation progresses through the Q&A chat function so that we don't have too much downtime at the end when questions are being submitted. Next slide, please. Okay, so what is a living alley? A living alley is a narrow, pedestrian-oriented street that is designed to focus on livability instead of parking and traffic. Typically, this means creating a street primarily for pedestrians and bicyclists, as well as a space for social uses. It can be considered an urban living room, as in when you enter a living alley, you feel the sensation that you're in a lively, homey space. In the later slides, Patrick will go over some examples of previously completed living alleys to give everyone an idea of what has been done and what is possible. Next slide, please. So here's a map of some potential living alleys within the Market Octavia plan area. The dark green lines represent alleys being considered for improvements in this phase. They're also listed on the right. The dark gray solid hatching represents the hub. The light gray solid represents the Market Octavia area, and the light green hatching represents existing open green space. Next slide, please. So the Living Alley program has transitioned from planning and is now under the direction of Public Works, and our team here will be providing implementation of this community-supported vision. The program has $4 million from Market Octavia impact fees, which the CAC has approved allocation of. The CAC has approved allocation of the fund for the Living Alley public realm improvements. Full funding will continue to come online through fiscal years 2023 to 2024 and will be apportioned each fiscal year. So essentially each year over the next 4 years, we'll be receiving a portion of the total 4 million. Next slide, please. And here we have our implementation timeline. This timeline is based on funding and typical design and construction durations. So today is workshop 1, which is the project kickoff. Following workshop 1 today, we will begin to draft concept designs to present at workshop 2 in August. And then moving forward, we will finalize that concept design into what should be a 10% drawing package to be presented at workshop 3 in October. Phase 1 construction will begin in January 2022. And as the construction of phase 1 is occurring and as more funding becomes available, we will start designing phase 2 concurrently. Yeah, so there's a timeline. Next slide, please. Oh, over to you, Patrick.
Great. Thanks so much, Arun. Hello, everybody. My name is Patrick Race, and I'm landscape architect here at San Francisco Public Works. Obviously, I would have preferred to see all of your faces in person, but thank you for bearing with us as we meet to discuss online virtually. Before we dive into the presentation, I wanted to take a step back and provide a brief introduction to how Living Alleys became a thing in San Francisco. And a lot of you know this, but Living Alleys is a concept that finds its origin within the Dutch idea of a living street, or Woonerf. And this term embodies the idea that streets can be seen as social spaces and not just a place for vehicular circulation, as so many of our streets are. So in this image of a typical Dutch Woonerf, you can see the blend of everyday activity and utility that takes place in this space. And note the areas of roadway being used for activation and bike parking and the impromptu tea party on the left and neighborly conversation. It's a model that has been replicated with success in other parts of the world, including here in San Francisco. Living alleys specific to this area of San Francisco have also been identified through various planning efforts. And so the Market Octavia Area Plan, adopted in 2008, grew out of the Market and Octavia Neighborhood Plan and Better Neighborhoods program. And it recognized this neighborhood's distinct set of opportunities, you know, as it sits at a confluence of 3 street grids, is central to many transportation, civic, institutional, entertainment, retail, and arts opportunities. So as part of this, the plan recognized the uniqueness of the rich alleyway network that we know so well and set forth several design principles to introduce improvements that create dynamic, shared, multi-purpose public space for the use of residents and visitors. And thus the Living Alley concept was born in San Francisco. The Living Alley Toolkit in 2015 took this idea to the next level, and I know a lot of you who are attending tonight were part of that process, wherein, you know, the city and community members came up with a resource guide for community members and designers to develop and implement living alleys, including design tools, example prototypes, cost estimates, and discussion on constraints and opportunities. Fast forward to now, the Market Octavia Plan Amendment, formerly known as the Hub, currently under adoption, proposes specific design recommendations for the alleys, mostly south of Market, within the plan area. So with these planning efforts, various design elements were introduced by each, and they define what a living alley can be. And we can keep these types of improvements in mind as we discuss the possibility for specific alleys to receive living alley improvements. But the list isn't exhaustive, and not every single thing on here will be applicable to a priority alley. These vary from greening opportunities, such as planting additional street trees and sidewalk gardens, to hardscape improvements, including special roadway or sidewalk paving, art opportunities, and improved, if not artistic, lighting. And so these improvements that would occur on private property, such as murals and green walls, aren't necessarily the focus of this project, but they're not impossible. We just need to keep in mind that improvements of this type would require an agreement with a private entity to cover items such as attachment of lights, maintenance, facade improvements, etc., because the city doesn't have the mechanism to fund or take care of private property improvements. In looking at the Market and Octavia neighborhood, we can look to precedents, many of which are in the neighborhood, of elements, programming, and complementary uses that we find intriguing and successful in creating a vital and vibrant alley. So these three examples are living alleys that have already been completed within the Market Octavia plan area, and then they include Linden Alley, the image on the top, between Goff and Octavia, which has most recently been improved with additional overhead lantern lighting, and Hickory Alley between Octavia and Laguna, which was an improvement provided by the adjacent Avalon development and is a single surface roadway and provides some green stormwater planters as well. And then the image in the lower right, Hickory Alley between Franklin and Van Ness Avenue, includes a mural component, lighting, and activation. And we'll look at some of these a little bit more in depth right now. So throughout tonight's discussion, to help spark some ideas, we can take a deeper look into some of the area precedents. So the first up is Linden Alley, which is arguably San Francisco's most celebrated living alley, and it's the original example within San Francisco. David Winslow Architecture and Loring Sagan envisioned alley improvements that would bring vitality to the space, and they used a community challenge grant to do this, and their scrappy know-how to run the gauntlet of city bureaucracy. Thankfully, the process is a lot easier than it was for them, but they were able to implement what is seen today back in 2010. The improvements include a portion of raised roadway, reclaimed granite benches, planters, and street trees. There is a second phase led by Place Lab, which is now part of San Francisco Parks Alliance, on behalf of Friends of Linden Alley, and they were able to secure another community challenge grant to provide overhead lanterns that we see today, sidewalk gardens, and planter benches, which expanded overall improvements west to Octavia. Hickory Alley, Van Ness to Franklin, is a recently completed project that includes a mural that spans 5 building facades, the decorative string lights, as you see in the picture, and programming. And so this is a photo by one of my colleagues at the alley lighting event this past February. It does seem kind of a lifetime ago at this point. But the project was initiated by Place Lab and San Francisco Parks Alliance via another community challenge grant, which is one of the funding recommendations outlined in the Living Alleys Toolkit. And they did this on behalf of Friends of Hickory. And the mural that you see on the left side of the photo was completed by ArtSpan and embodies a visualization of an answer to the question, what does music look like? Going across Octavia to another stretch of Hickory Alley, Octavia to Laguna, is an example of a development streetscape improvements, and I mentioned that earlier. The adjacent Avalon development worked to design a single surface right-of-way complete with stormwater planters, seating, and ground floor walk-up units that front onto the alley. Traveling to the Lower Polk neighborhood, Fern Alley was part of the Polk Streetscape project opening last year. The alley was envisioned as a flexible space that could host the neighborhood's art walk and other programming such as movie nights and other events sponsored by the CBD that's there and other organizations. And the alley included decorative paving, pedestrian scaled artistic lighting, and tree plantings. Annie Alley, or Annie Street Plaza in the Soma neighborhood, was a temporary street plaza within an underutilized alleyway that included seating, the performance stage that you see, lighting and planting. And this was an interagency effort along with the Yerba Buena CBD and Spur that sought to provide an active focal point in this heavily pedestrian traffic neighborhood, providing performances, food trucks, and other activation. Also in Soma, Ringgold Alley is an example of providing character-defining features that tell a story about the neighborhood's history in San Francisco. And in this case, you can see the additional sidewalk space was given to provide decorative paving and the granite pillar elements that honor leather culture. Not shown in the photo, there are bronze footprints within the sidewalk paving that honor specific individuals as well. Belden Place is an example of a narrow commercial alley in the financial district where the city made improvements to make it more conducive to the surrounding uses. So as we know, outdoor dining is here day and night, and the narrow street and sidewalk were made one level, and businesses, or I guess the business owners, strung lights to create a unique atmosphere that is known throughout the Bay Area. And then finally, traveling across the bay into Oakland, this image, formerly horse stables, is Temescal Alley in Oakland, and it's an example of a tiny shopping alley bordered by ground floor retail and simple improvements such as planters, movable tables and chairs, and public art. And its narrow right-of-way provides an intimate feel, but these simple activating elements lend the space with a feeling of vitality. So those are some examples to keep in mind. Turning back to the task at hand, we can think about the potential of additional living alley improvements. We need to consider the open space context of the neighborhood, which has many wonderful neighborhood serving open spaces that provide active and passive recreation. And these include everything from the open spaces around City Hall, the newly renovated and soon to open Margaret Hayward Playground, Stevenson Alley, which is a good example of special paving within the alleys south of Market, and other active neighborhood parks and open spaces like Patricia's Green and Hayes Valley and Buchanan Street Mall in Western Addition, which provides many active and programmed events. So we also have to think about who these improvements will be serving, both right now and into the future. There also might be opportunities to collaborate with developments who are also proposing alleyway improvements so that we can get the most bang for our buck. We know that within the Civic Center Market Octavia area, over 4,900 new housing units have been built or are under construction, and additional units are expected as part of the plan amendment. And so this means there's going to be an increased demand for high quality public spaces and almost this secondary pedestrian network of alleyways, which is really where living alleys shine and live up to their full neighborhood serving potential. They provide a quieter, vibrant public realm not possible with the larger arterials in the area like Van Ness or Goff or Franklin. So when looking at criteria, we recognize that there has been a massive amount of work already done by the community in developing the concept of living alleys. So now that we have some city implementation funding, how do we choose which alley receives improvements within the limited budget that we have? The city will use this list of criteria when considering candidate alleys. The first, shown in blue, stakeholder input, is why we're here tonight, as we're working with you to prioritize alleys for improvements, as well as design elements. So again, as Arun mentioned, please provide any Q&As or I guess just the Qs, we'll be doing the As. Any comments or stories that you have in the Q&A pane, which is I think to the right of your screen. And also we will provide a link to our survey and website at the end of the presentation. Other high priority criteria the city team will be considering include current infrastructure projects and condition of roadway. We'll be looking to see if there are any projects where we can combine forces to implement improvements and make our budget stretch further. And I've noted that by the small dollar signs in the titles. Those alleys which have recently been repaved may essentially provide a clean canvas and quicker implementation relatively, given that underground utility work likely was done as part of the repaving. And so the city will be carefully considering these alleys as priorities. Current development projects, as I mentioned earlier, may be an opportunity to combine forces. An example of this is the 98 Franklin project, which is currently being reviewed by planning. They've indicated improvements to Lily Alley as part of their development. And it just so happens that that alley has also been identified for improvements within the Market Octavia plan amendment or the hub. So there might be some synergy there. We'll be looking at adjacent land use and ground floor condition, as it's important when considering the stewardship and potential activation of the alleys to provide an active ground floor condition. And then also the potential for programming and site stewardship when we think about activities and maintenance of the space. And finally, existing concept plans that have already been developed as part of past planning efforts or by the community. So to break a couple of these down visually, we can see here upcoming sewer paving and or other infrastructure projects as an opportunity to layer on living alley improvements while the street is under construction. Here, excuse me, here's a look at some alleys which have been recently repaved or have good paving condition, which may allow for some improvement opportunities without the need to repave the alley. As I mentioned, likely most of the underground utility work has been completed, so we essentially have a blank canvas for improvements that can be implemented relatively quickly in comparison to another alley that might need utility work as part of paving upgrades. And then this map is showing where some development synergies might exist for combined streetscape improvements. I mentioned the 98 Franklin development. There's also the Plumbers Union Brady Block development south of Market, and the 78 Hay project, which I believe is nearing completion if it hasn't been already. In blue, you can see alleys that have had concept designs developed for them through past planning processes or community applications. Most of these alleys lie within the Market Octavia Plan Amendment, or the HUB area, which outlines streetscape improvements being funded and implemented as part of the public benefits package associated with that plan. So there may be other funding mechanisms to get some of the other alleys built, but we'll be taking that into consideration. So, given the limited budget that we have, we can start to consider what balance of alleys and improvements we want to have. So, for example, do we want to have many alleys that receive a light touch, or would we rather have one alley with extensive improvements? So this matrix begins to outline potential improvements that are associated with each level. Light improvements generally might include sidewalk planters and or new street trees and simple lighting improvements. Medium improvements may include more extensive elements such as decorative paving, raised crossings, sidewalk extensions, and above ground planters. And then extensive improvements may include everything I just mentioned, but to a more extensive degree, and may include more seating elements, partial raised roadway, and enhanced lighting. To give you some real world examples of what those level of improvements look like, Hickory Alley is a great example of light but effective improvements, which include the 5-building mural that I mentioned earlier, pedestrian scale string lighting, and programmed events. But again, I want to call out, as I did earlier, improvements on private property like the mural and lighting anchors and potentially the lighting source aren't necessarily the focus of this effort, but we need to keep in mind that improvements such as this would require an agreement with a private entity to cover these items. So not impossible, but we just need to keep that in mind. Fern Alley in the Lower Polk neighborhood, we saw an image of that earlier, is a good example of medium level improvements. The roadway in this case was part of the overall paving project. So fresh asphalt would not be included in this estimate, I guess, this medium level of improvement. But improvements such as the sidewalk planters, new street trees, and decorative roadway inlay, and pedestrian and street scale lighting were layered into the paving project. And so in addition to looking great, the CBD hosts programming in the alley, such as movie nights and Lower Polk Art Walk events. And then extensive level of improvements, Linden Alley is a good example of this. It includes a raised crossing, partial raised roadway, pedestrian and street scale lighting, new street trees, sidewalk planters, and seating. This level of improvement extended along an entire alley would be an extensive improvement. So that's an example of what that looks like. It's also an example of where retail ground floor uses help to activate the space. There's, Blue Bottles there and a bunch of other retail shops as well. So what does this all mean? Now that we've reviewed what the Living Alleys program is, where the idea came from, and some of the real world examples in SF, what is our task for tonight? We have a limited amount of implementation funding, around $4 million, spread across many years. So we know that a limited number of alleys will be able to receive improvements. So we need your help to prioritize alleys to receive them. Given that we're not allowed to congregate as a large group to discuss, we will be handling feedback in a couple of different ways, as Arun mentioned. The first is to type in any questions or suggestions or stories that you may have directly into the Q&A panel right now. And we'd also like all of you to take our online survey, which asks a few simple questions to help us understand your priority alleys and types of improvements. This feedback will inform draft concept designs, which we'll bring back to all of you in the coming months, with the ultimate goal of arriving at a final concept design in fall 2020, as Arun mentioned, after which we'll draw up plans and enter construction in the coming years. We hope, however, in the interim space between these workshops, to be visiting stakeholder groups either in person or virtually, hopefully the former, and to be out on site to answer any questions that you may have. But for the time being, we encourage you to visit our website and take the online survey to provide your feedback. These slides will be available on the website starting tomorrow. The survey is live now, so it's ready to go. On the right side of the slide, currently displayed is a QR code that you can use to access the survey via your smartphone's camera. It should recognize it and immediately take you to the website. Or you can visit us on the web at sfpublicworks.org/living-alleys. So with that, if you have any questions, comments, stories to share, please feel free to enter those in the Q&A panel right now, and we'll try to address them. So thank you. So with that, we have a facilitator moderator who will be aiding us in fielding some of your questions, and Arun and I will be responding to them.
Thank you. Then my name is Alex Murillo. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Let's actually start off with the very first question. It was submitted anonymously from one of the neighbors. It says, first, thank you for this effort. I'm super excited about the local impact for our neighborhoods. Question, how much forward thinking of future foot traffic is there in considering streets to improve? For example, with new sky rises, both the Brady Corridor and Lafayette Minna are excellent opportunities for social space, with hundreds of new people coming into these neighborhoods within the next 3 to 4 years. Can these areas be prioritized?
That is a great question, and it's something that the Market Octavia Plan Amendment, or formerly known as the HUB planning effort, took a look at those alleys in great detail specifically, and it does recognize the additional housing units that are going in that area, and it also recognizes the need for public open space in the South of Market area, especially at that location. Those two alleys that you mentioned, I believe you mentioned Minna and Lafayette, do have concept plans associated with them as part of the HUB, or excuse me, it's now called the Market Octavia Plan Amendment. They outline potential improvements as part of their public realm plan. It's also, because it's within that planning area, it becomes a candidate for the public benefits package. So new development will obviously pay into a pot of fees, some of which can be used for streetscape improvements. Of that, Minna and Lafayette alleys have been identified for improvements. So hopefully we'll see those improvements sooner than later, but it's something we'll be looking at through our selection criteria as well. And part of that is the synergies with adjacent development. And so that's kind of a boiled down way to say, yes, we will be looking at increased foot traffic associated with that development.
Perfect, thank you. One of the other questions from one of the neighbors is, most of these alleys have retail or sometimes heavy retail like Belden Place or Temescal Alley. What is the difference between those alleys with retail and those without retail?
Well, oftentimes we look at the ground floor condition because that's going to be the 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week condition that you see on the alley. Some of the most successful alleys and streets in general have a very vital and active ground floor, and oftentimes that means retail. And we saw a lot of those photos in the precedents. That doesn't mean, however, that you can't have an active alley without ground floor retail. And an example of this is Hickory, I guess, from Van Ness to Franklin. There's Cala Taco, and there are some retail establishments there. but it's also an opportunity for a neighborhood group or a friends of group like Friends of Hickory to come up with an activation plan, to come up with a program plan to pair with physical improvements to the alleyway, which can create a vital and vibrant alleyway in that way without being bordered by ground floor retail on all sides. Similarly, the other Hickory Alley example we saw earlier has a ground floor condition of residential walk-up units or residential units, which again, if paired with improvements that are complementary to the neighborhood and the residents as a whole, can be quite compelling, and is also a stage to be set for future programming and site stewardship as well. So alleys come in all different shapes and sizes. We will be looking at ground floor condition and the potential for activation, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it needs to be bordered on all sides by retail.
Perfect, thank you. There's a question from one of the neighbors out there. Is there an interim step to becoming a formal living alley? For example, this neighbor lives on Germania Street, and folks are using the street to have their kids play at the end of the day. Every time a driver speeds through the street, it frightens everyone. Ideally, the neighbors would like to have the street limited to traffic. Is there a way to make an interim type of step before becoming a formal living alley?
Arun, do you want to field this one?
Hi, yeah, sorry, I was on mute. Patrick, are you familiar if Germania Street is included on our list currently, or is the question being asked, how do we add Germania Street onto the list?
I believe Germania is part of the living alleys identified by the Market Octavia plan.
Okay, so if it is included in the plan now and it's in the survey, essentially we will be using the rubric that was provided in this presentation, looking at the 6 different factors to help determine where improvements can be made. So it's going to be based on funding and our determination based on the 6 different categories. Current infrastructure projects and condition of roadways and current development projects are going to be the more heavily weighted categories, simply because there is a lot of cost savings and synergies that we can have there. So yeah, it's just going to be based on funding as funding becomes available and as we can determine the priority and the rubric allows us to do so.
Perfect, thank you. Another neighbor asked, once the alleys are revamped and more lived in, who will perform the ongoing maintenance and cleaning? Would it be residents of the alleyway or would it be Public Works?
Yeah, so for ongoing maintenance, we'll be looking at both the stewardship from the residents as well as Public Works. It would be a combined effort. You know, we are looking for stakeholders to be stewards in this process and help us develop a maintenance plan that can be effective in maintaining the improvements that we do implement. So I think it's going to be a combined effort.
Thank you. One of the neighbors asks, is there historical relevance taken into account at all in the selection process? For instance, Woodward Street and Woodward Gardens. It seems like the city would want to highlight streets that tie back to its history.
Yeah, thanks for the question, and I hear you out, I agree. But at the end of the day, we are going to be looking at the entire Market Octavia area as a whole, and you know, to use our funds effectively, we want to provide improvements to blocks that would essentially make the most sense in terms of all of those different factors that we're looking at. You know, we don't want to go in and install improvements on a street that is going to be paved in 3 years. You know, we ideally we'll be looking at different paving contracts that are coming out and developments, and looking to work with these contracts to ensure that whatever we do put in has longevity and it'll last long. So of course we will be looking at all the different categories. Historical relevance may play a part in that, but at the end of the day, we do want to use this money effectively and stick to our rubric and ensure that whatever we do put in will remain for the community for a long time.
And I think I would add to, for those of you who have ideas of different alleys for different reasons, certainly put that into the survey so that we're aware of that, because that's how we're catching your feedback. And I think, you know, looking back on the Ringgold example and thinking about Woodward Gardens, the design of a living alley is a great opportunity, if it's a direction we want to pursue, to tease out, you know, the history of the neighborhood and the character of the neighborhood. And so I think that would be one example to your example of Woodward Garden.
Thank you. One of the neighbors, AB, has expressed excitement about the project. Very excited. AB goes on to ask, are there ways for neighbors to help get more funding for improvements like this through traditional or untraditional means? For example, crowdfunding or calling their representatives? I
would certainly say yes, and Arun, you can add on to my answer.
Yeah.
This pot of funding, you know, is fairly limited. It's from the Market Octavia impact fees, so we know we have this pot of money. But there are other implementation mechanisms that we've seen in the past through the community challenge grants that I mentioned earlier. The Living Alleys Toolkit has other implementation recommendations as part of that. That also included the community challenge grant. It could also be an opportunity for you to lobby your supervisor to give funds that way for certain safety improvements or public realm improvements that you, the neighbors, feel like should be happening independent of this effort. So I think there are other funding streams. And then of course, you know, private fundraising is also an option. Linden Alley at its first iteration was largely that way, along with a community challenge grant. So there are many different ways that public space improvements can be implemented. This is only one way that we're presenting to you tonight.
Thank you. This is a comment, not so much of a question. One of the neighbors says, I would like to prioritize public money on alleys that benefit existing residents. New developments can fund their own local improvements. That was a comment. We will go on to a question now from another neighbor. This one's anonymous. Has indicated, can we use some of the light funding to spread out to clean the current alleys and streets all over Octavia/Market, as well as adding streetlights and plants to improve safety?
Yeah, so I can answer that. So I can't see the question there, but so we do have restrictions in the allocation of this funding. So in terms of cleaning up, this funding specifically must be used for infrastructure improvements and beautification of the streets and corridors. And although these funds cannot specifically address the concerns of cleanliness, our goal is, when we're designing, to ensure that whatever we do install and construct can be easily maintained and cleaned for future use. I think there's a second part regarding installation of trees and benches. Yeah, this funding can definitely be used for landscape elements such as trees and benches. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Patrick.
That sounds good.
I can't find the question.
We have another neighbor who thanks you for doing this. It is timely and much appreciated. We have another neighbor who says, I am a member of the Hickory Alley Group. We are very happy with the outcome of our efforts, but we're pretty frustrated by the length of time it took to maneuver the amount of barriers we encountered. Can we make it easier for folks to complete the wanted project? We also have had problems with people using Hickory as a drive-through to get to Van Ness Avenue. Is there something we could do to help reduce cars driving through that street?
So with any, I guess addressing the latter part of that question first, the traffic circulation obviously is a huge determinant in what we can do with a street. And so the through traffic on Hickory is an example of an undesirable condition, but a lot of analysis goes into any street changes, any curb changes, any additional crossings that we're adding. So we'll be considering all those things if we are changing the geometry of the street. So I'm sorry that there seems to be a lot of pass-through traffic going through Hickory, but that's something that we could consider and further analyze if Hickory rises to the top as a priority alley. And to your earlier part of the, I guess, a comment of just how long it took to implement Hickory, I think this process may be a little faster, especially as I mentioned earlier, for alleys that have recently been repaved, given that a lot of the infrastructure work has already been put in place and is essentially a clean canvas for us to put public realm elements on. I think the community challenge grant and just going independently is an excellent way to add public realm elements, but oftentimes it may take a little bit longer rather than a city sponsored project like this.
Okay, thank you, Patrick. We have a question from one of the neighbors who would like a little more clarity on how difficult, it's a little difficult for them to gauge how much 4 million, how far 4 million can go. Linden Street was extensive. They are asking if you have an estimate of how much it took to complete Linden Street and roughly how much 4 million would potentially get us as far as alleyway improvements.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can answer that. So I'm not familiar with what the exact costs of Linden Street was, but for the question of how far 4 million can go, I would say an extensive construction project would come in around 2 million. That's obviously, that includes like extensive planting, all the pedestrian lighting, decorative pavings, raised roadways where permitted. So yeah, I can't answer the question to how the exact cost of Linden Street, but an extensive project could run anywhere from 2 to 3 million from design to construction.
Thank you, sir. We have a comment from one of the neighbors who had lived in the Netherlands, had indicated Rosemont Place has a group of very active neighbors who want a place for our kids to play and more greenery. That neighbor goes on to suggest that the city prioritize funds by funding more projects as opposed to a limited number of expensive interventions. A little unclear on that one. Let's see what else.
So I think it goes back to thinking about the balance of how many improvements we want versus how many alleys can actually be touched by the limited funding that we have. So as Arun mentioned, we're looking at $2 to $3 million for an extensive improvement. So we might get one extensive alley and maybe one light touch alley. So please visit our survey. Let us know what balance you prefer. If you would rather see 5 alleys receive light touch improvements that improve, safety and livability and vitality of the alley, that's great. If you would rather see one alley that's, like a Linden Alley example, that's just kind of the flagship of the neighborhood, that's certainly something that we want to know. So please do take our survey.
Thank you. Let me pull up another question here. Bear with me. This is a comment from one of the neighbors who says these living alleys already have people living among them. There are homes, some people smoking, talking, gathering under the windows of people's homes. May be fine for some folks who do not live along the alleys, who would not be impacted by additional noises and nuances. How is this beneficial to the people who live along the alleys?
Yeah, so I can comment on that. So yeah, I believe Living Alleys, the program, when implemented, can help provide an open and lively space to the public, and it should essentially bring positive foot traffic to the alleys. And we're hoping for everyone's community feedback today, the essential stakeholders to bring comments, submit your surveys and submit any questions that will help us assess which alleys, need these improvements and will benefit from these improvements, and will be the best candidates for these improvements so that they're effective in providing the community with benefits rather than noises and nuisances.
Okay, thank you. One neighbor goes on to ask, how do you measure success or fail on a project? What is the goal? How do you measure it?
I'll answer that. So success and failure. So from project management perspective, the goal is to, fall within budget and within schedule, and provide a scope that the public is proud of and that they want. So two big factors that we can gauge quantitatively would be schedule. If we can provide you these upgrades within our planned schedule, the schedule that we provided today's presentation, as well as provide, multiple alley upgrades within our budget, an extensive and a light or 5 lights. So we know what this money is capable of doing, and if we can effectively implement the budget to provide the community with something that should fall within our budget and within our schedule, then that is, that would essentially be a qualitative analysis that this is a successful project. And hearing from the public following the construction and hearing that they are happy with the scope and what we provided them with will be another factor in determining if it's a successful project.
And we'll be coming back to you, in a couple months with some concept designs for the priority alleys that have been identified. And I think these moments of engagement are an opportunity for all of you to offer us insight into any course corrections that need to be made in terms of where the design is going to really ensure that these projects are successful for the neighborhood and everyone who is able to enjoy them.
Thank you. This is a follow-up comment from Bob. He indicated that on Hickory, they had roughly $210,000 to spend and found it went very fast. Lighting and large murals can take a great deal of the money.
Yeah, so that's correct. Lighting and murals would probably fall under a light construction, and estimating a light construction around $500,000. So yeah, that's in line with what our budget thoughts are.
And just to add a little bit of context, in further research, the Fern Alley example that I mentioned earlier, which did not include the actual asphalt paving, but did include all the other improvements, for one block was around $900,000. So, but that is, a pretty extensive alley, even if we do categorize it as medium level improvements.
Thank you. And that's it right now that I see here as far as questions. Let me, if anybody else would like to submit questions, please feel free to do so. Patrick and Arun, if you have anything else right now, while we're waiting for more questions to come on in.
Sure. I think, as I mentioned earlier, we have 2 ways to get your feedback tonight, but I think, we'll be watching the COVID situation and city regulations, but at some point we do want to be out on site, whether that's, Arun and I out, or project information, just physically out in the space to reach those who don't necessarily have an interest in connecting with us online. So we'll be figuring that out, but I do encourage you to visit our website early and often. We'll put all the latest information there as to when we'll be out on site. As I mentioned, these slides will be uploaded tomorrow. The survey is live right now, so please do participate in that, but we will keep you posted. These are interesting times. It does make it a slightly more challenging to connect with all of you, but I appreciate you bearing with us.
Thank you, Patrick. We have a comment from another neighbor who says, hello, and thank you for hosting this workshop. I currently live on Rose Street between Octavia and Laguna. As you probably know, the city has the bike pilot project that closes Page Street to freeway traffic. This has been a great overall for our neighborhood, but we have seen an uptick of people driving the wrong way down Rose Street. It would be wonderful to see some funding go to making it less enticing to drive the wrong way down these alleys.
That's some really good anecdotal data that we can use. We will take that information back to our MTA team members and make sure they know about it.
Here's another comment. I'm all about living alleys, and we have a lot of alleys in my neighborhood which already serve as an example of them. I walk alleys on a frequent basis. To me, the best example of a winner in the Market Octavia plan is Elgin Park. Through traffic management, it rises as a true example of a living street. Why do we have to wait so long for them to be implemented? Alleys are a shared space and they should be used to build community, not separate them. To commenters, citizens, not planners, determine the benefit of use. Of use. Please respect that. That was a comment. Let's see what else we could find. And Bob follows up again saying that the lights and mural were well worth it and have made our alley much more livable and much safer. Thank you, Bob.
That's great. It's a beautiful improvement.
That's great to hear.
How will we, and this is a question being asked by Century Electric, how will you address how will you address businesses who need vehicular access to the alleys that feed their businesses?
So that's a good question, and it's something that we carefully consider when we're talking about building access, whether it's commercial, loading or residential garage access, also on-street parking. All of these things are under consideration as we think about trade-offs. Living alleys are not going to restrict any delivery or building access. I think there is opportunity to consolidate building functions, if possible, to a single point along an alley. It may not be possible, and that's okay. We'll work with what we've got. There's also opportunity to consolidate parking to one side of the street or another, or get rid of it altogether, depending on what community tenor is, or keep it. We want to find ways to make the alleys the best that they can be. And so by freeing up as much curb space or parking space or what have you gives us additional opportunities to expand the public realm or the pedestrian realm, potentially through expanded sidewalks. Maybe it's through just decorative paving to create a more active node within the alley. These are things that we're all going to consider. But to your original question, commercial loading and access, residential loading and access generally will not be affected by any design interventions that we're proposing.
Thank you, Patrick. We're waiting for a couple more questions to come on in. See if something comes up.
And thank all of you for your stories. I enjoy hearing about how you're using the alleys. It's interesting.
We've got one comment from neighbor says, I live on a residential alley, Clinton Park, and would love to see more space for pedestrian, bicyclists, and plants on our alleys. Fruit trees and edible gardens could provide additional benefits.
Great, thank you. So it looks like we have just a few minutes left. If you haven't had a chance to put in a question or a comment, or you think of something later on down the road, please again visit our website or our survey. This is kind of the most important aspect of feedback that we can have during these times. So please do make it known, any comments or questions that you may have.
I don't see any new questions popping up, so I apologize.
I think there's, it may be updating differently, but I do see a feedback talking about activation and budget, looking at an example from Oakland, how residents took back their public space to activate during the protests with art. And it sounds like it's now become an outdoor gallery for all Bay Area residents. And so they're wondering how we can do the same to activate our alleys in an authentic way. And I guess maybe I would turn that question over to some of my other colleagues who may have more experience with how we can interface as Public Works with the community to get this done.
Do you mind asking the question again, Patrick?
Sure, sorry about that. So it looks like CC says, you mentioned activation, budget limitations, and need for outdoor public space. And I think we should take notes from Oakland. Residents took back their public space basically for free to activate downtown during the protests with art. It's become an outdoor gallery for all Bay Area residents. It's punk rock, and we can do it too. How can Public Works help us organize to activate our alleys in an authentic way?
So yeah, activation can happen with or without the assistance of Public Works. But what Public Works can help with is permitting of events and or interventions that might affect temporary traffic closures to allow pedestrian use of a space, etc. But yeah, the time is right for those kind of activities, and they're happening all around us successfully, I'd say.
Great, thank you.
All right, so it looks like that's all the time we have. We're at 7:01. Just want to thank everyone here for taking the time to listening to our presentation and submitting any questions that you may have had. If we weren't able to answer your questions tonight, please use the link in the chat to go to the survey and our project webpage, and you'll be able to submit any additional questions there, and we'll do our best to answer as fast as we can. So yes, thank you everyone, and I look forward to working with everyone. The team, we look forward to working with the community on this project, and hopefully we can provide everyone with something that is beneficial and that they're proud of. So thank you. I'll be ending the session now.